before you lecture me for drinking beer at 1 in the afternoon while shooting videos, yeah, don't. Greetings from January 28th, 2020, friends, e-friends, future friends, and everybody else. Whether you like it or not, I'm doing another video on the Husqvarna 26-inch Multipurpose Forest Axe. This is a multi-purpose axe. Its purpose is as a compromise axe that can do a little bit of almost everything, but it won't necessarily do anything the best. If it does anything the best of, you know, axe designs or whatever, I mean, you can nitpick, but it's being a compromise. It's short enough to carry, relatively easy. It's relatively light compared to a lot of axes. You can use it with one hand because it's pretty light. I mean, you can use a lot of axes with one hand, but you can use it pretty easy. Anyway, one of those tasks is chopping wood, not splitting wood, chopping wood. So the distinction being that chopping is cutting across the grain of, say, you know, a horizontal log, and splitting is splitting down, up and down the tree to split the grain apart rather than cutting through the grain. If it's going to be a multi-purpose tool, it should chop reasonably well. Now, there are people who will argue, and some of them very competent bush people, that an axe should split well first rather than chop well first. I wholeheartedly disagree with that, respectfully, or not, depending on who it is. But I think that a multi-purpose axe should be ground to chop well. That doesn't mean that it should be ground for like competition, you know, because that's going to make it like relatively fragile. If it's a real, like, you know, out in the woods, working in the woods, in the field, like, the edge should be reasonably durable in my personal preference. But I do think it should be set up to chop, and don't worry about splitting. I can make this split no matter how it's set up, and so I'm going to set it up to chop. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about first what I'm doing and why, and I think this is of the utmost importance. I'm going to talk about axe geometry, but I'm not going to go super deep because I already have a video planned that's like a full-on geek out session with the chalkboard on why axes do and don't cut. But I'm going to touch on some of those points briefly. There's a lot of conversations, I just saw another one, where people are often speaking slightly different languages in terms of like axe geometry. And it's not always, like, in some cases they don't even understand their own position, which means I kind of don't have one. Like, terms will substitute for understanding, and you can have these conversations, but like, do they mean anything? And sometimes like people are kind of talking past each other because they're, or people will say something and it gets interpreted wrong because, again, people aren't necessarily speaking the same language. In many cases, those people understand what they mean, but it may not be communicated. So what I'm going to do is, instead of talking about just throwing out some angles and stuff like that, I'm going to describe why axes do and don't cut briefly. Axes need 2 angles to cut. Now, that's not exactly true, because many axes, the geometry is a really complex mess of variable curves. Like, on some axes there will be no flat spots, and some people advocate that there are no flat spots on the axe anywhere, basically, that, you know, in the cutting edge. Other people like me will have large flat areas. But if you were to reduce an axe to 2 angles, every axe, if you could reduce every axe to 2 angles, you can make an axe cut with 2 angles, but you can't make it cut well with 1 angle. Now, you can take those 2 angles after they're established, or you can imagine them theoretically, and then round them and blend them together and all kinds of stuff to make it more complicated, like, say, something like this here. If you can reduce it mentally in your mind, or physically, you can also do this physically, and we're basically going to do it today in a way. You can reduce any axe to 2 different angles, but you can't reduce it to 1 angle. So often people will throw out terms, and we're not always speaking the same language. One instance is if you say micro bevel, what I think of as a micro bevel, and I feel like I have a pretty good argument for reserving the term micro bevel for very, very, very small bevels, like almost invisible or just barely visible or very, very, very small. If I can see a bevel easily, I consider that a secondary bevel. Okay, so let's talk about what this axe is like now, what I'm going to do to it, and why. So first we're going to talk about this. I like the heel right here to lag slightly behind the toe. So we're going to take this. This is an actual tracing of the axe. It's a little bit bigger because, of course, I was tracing around the outside of the edge. And you see how we have a slight tilt to the average, you know, of the toe and the heel here. So that's what I want. That's good. I'm not going to change that. If that weren't there, like if the heel were out here, I would take it back. One thing I may do is take a little bit of this curve out. The reason is, well, first of all, I don't like very curved axes. This is not very curved. I wouldn't really say it's too curved, but it's like a little more curved than I want. And the flatter it is, the better it is for hewing flat surfaces. So at some point, this curvature starts to become a problem. I'm not going to have any significant problem using this axe for anything else if I take a little bit of that curve out. So I'm probably going to file a little bit of this out and just bring this back just a hair, maybe that much, maybe not. Interestingly, this is a little bit closer to what the Gransfors Bruks version of this axe is. Their multi-purpose forest axe is a little bit flatter here. Okay, right now this looks roughly like this. I mean, that's a bad drawing, but you know, it has a big eye, which is typical of European axes. That big eye comes down closer to or even thinner than a typical American axe. So the bit is fairly thin here, right? But it still doesn't cut well. Why not? Because this is more important than this. If this had it didn't come in at all like that, and it had just, let me draw. If this was just like that, and just, you know, there wasn't this thing where it comes in and it's kind of like a long skinny bit, it would really cut not much different. I mean, it's not going to make this gigantic difference. This makes much more of a difference right here. We need to deal with the width of this secondary bevel. And again, this bevel won't necessarily be flat. It might be curved, more like this picture. I kind of tried to draw this as an expanded version. You can average it out. So you can say like it's pretty straight coming down here and then it curves in suddenly. So, you know, something like this, although it's really, this is important, it's more like this. Okay, I don't want to get into this too much. Again, it's hard not to just go deep into this. But this is another place where people will use like alternative languages, or they speak a different language. So there are people who would refer to this as this angle. So let's say you drew a straight line from here to here and here to here, and you measured that straight angle right there. They would refer to this yellow line, the curvature here, as that angle convex. So let's say it's 15 degrees. They would say 15-degree convex bevel or 20-degree convex bevel. I disagree. How I would measure this is to do these two lines. Okay, this line and this line, I would measure that bevel. 35-degree convex bevel is what I would call that. These are completely different things. So you see the problem when we're having conversations about this. If we don't specify what we mean by a convex bevel, it doesn't work. So the common assertion is that, here I go, a convex bevel is stronger. I disagree. A convex bevel is weaker, but it's just how I define a convex bevel. And if someone says a convex bevel, a 15-degree convex bevel is stronger, it reveals the way that they define a 15-degree convex bevel, if they understand that at all and have their own, you know, specific thought out definition. Regardless, whether we do it this way or that way, we can average out that we have two different basic angles here. We have one coming down and then we have a second one on the edge. And again, we need two in order for the axe to function. Okay, so let's redraw this. Say it's coming down at a relatively consistent angle, and then it kind of comes in at the end like this. And this is kind of what's on there right now. That was terrible. Okay, this axe will not cut well, because what is important? You may think like this is important, and as this goes in the wood, it's going to cause interference, right? Because it gets wider as it goes. Let's say that, you know, it was actually like this, so just like a perfect wedge, which is the best reference for any axe, theoretical or practical, is a wedge. So if this was a perfect wedge, it's gonna, you know, as the axe sinks in, it pushes the wood apart, right? And it causes friction as it goes. And you think, well, a thin axe is gonna sink much deeper. To some extent, yeah, but that wedge also serves a purpose, which is to push away chips and break them free. But what's more important here, okay? So if we had a wedge like that, let's say, and it'll sink into wood fine, but we take it like this and we put this kind of an edge on it. Just like a fat, blunt, you know, long bevel like that. That axe isn't going to cut well because as it hits here, it's like a speed bump, right? It goes in and it's going to have this effect where the wood is opposing, the wood that you're cut is opposing the cut this way. And that matters much more than the actual degree of this. They both matter and there's an interplay between the two. But this is really, really important. And almost all axes that come from the factory, whether the bit's thin or not, have this fairly chubby, you know, blunt edge on them. So what we're going to do with this axe is basically make a line from about the eye. Like if I were to set this on the eye, and you can use a file for this, I'm going to file this down right here, this extra meat right here, because this is real thick, like the bit's thick here, and I'm going to file that down and just bring it down like this really close to the edge. Okay, so now I've taken the meat that was all up in here and I've filed it down. So I kind of took out like a bunch of material right in this area mostly and kind of going up into here a little bit like that, and brought it down really close to the edge. Okay, now there's no interference, right, at this edge. It no longer looks like this. It's going to look a little more like that. Now look at how much interference we've done away with by doing that. Compare, you know, this to that. Okay, now this axe will cut. However, if we were to take this flat grind, and now these are just flat here, they're pretty much flat. If we were to take that all the way down to the edge and just come to a perfect sharp edge at this angle, which is going to be like, I don't know, somewhere between probably 15, you know, 15 degrees, give or take something, maybe 17, maybe 13, whatever. I don't even know. I don't really measure those things too much. The only reason I really measure them is to talk to you guys about them. It's going to be super fragile and it's going to break. It's going to either break or it's going to bend. Doesn't matter what you cut. If you take this down to like a perfect 15 degrees and it's just like dead sharp, you're going to take one swing into a piece of wood and it's going to bend or it's going to break or quickly get damaged. So that's why we need two bevels. That's why I say that we need, you know, two basic bevels for any axe to work. So we're just going to put on a small secondary bevel here, then we have an axe that cuts. If you hand most people an axe and a file and say, you know, file this so that it cuts, or, you know, grind this axe, they won't take off enough material to make the axe cut really well. Now, if you take this to extremes and do a super thin grind here and make this super, super narrow, you're going to have an axe that cuts really well, but it's going to be relatively fragile. So there's an interplay between all of these factors. What is this angle? Is it super thin or is it a little bit on the wider side? You know, it could be 20 degrees, it could be 13 degrees. And how wide is this and what angle is that? So we may have an axe that's say 15 degrees here and then 30 degrees on the very edge, but that 30 degrees can vary. If it's like 1 millimeter wide, that axe is going to be more fragile and more likely to break than if it's an 1/8 of an inch wide or a 1/16 of an inch wide or whatever. But I hope this helps you understand better why axes do and don't cut. And factory axes look basically like this axe, where they have like a pretty fat, chubby end, and that end is really durable. Like if people are abusing the axe, if you're splitting wood on the ground and banging it into the ground all the time, you know, if you grind an axe like this and it has a relatively small secondary bevel, it's going to cut great, but it is going to be a little bit more fragile for like outright abuse. I mean, it doesn't matter if you know, occasionally stick it in the dirt or something like that, but if you're splitting wood and driving it into the ground all the time and stuff like that, that edge isn't going to hold up. But very few people are grinding their axes to the point where they'll cut really well. If you want to see someone who grinds their axes that way and chops where, you know, the axe is obviously very effective, you can watch, well, I have one video, it's called Axe Only Firewood Processing, I think. Owen Jarvis, check out his channel, and Ben Scott, who now runs the Cordwood Challenge that I originally started and handed over to him. Okay, that's all I want to say about that for now. I'm going to describe this later in more complete terms with, you know, analogies that can be easily understood by everybody and will help really cement this idea. Okay, let's get filing. First things first, we're going to just take a little bit of this curvature out for the reasons I explained. More than not for carving flat surfaces. If you want to ruin a file really fast, a great way to do it is to file across a thin sharp edge like this, because each tooth is hitting it. Listen, you hear how it just one tooth at a time just grinds over that. Don't do that if you can help it. I mean, there's situations where you kind of have to do it. Just use an old file if you have one. Much better to go with the edge like this. And I have no real plan here. I didn't draw this out. I'm just going to file it a bit, look at it, file it some more. This is all kind of instinct here. You get this angle right. Okay. You may not want to push it in an exact, you know, straight angle, just not across. This won't take long. This is going to increase the total amount of work I have to do filing for sure. Looking better. If you have a strong opinion about this, I'd love to hear it. Just as long as it's, you know, constructive and everything. I know some people prefer a very strong curve. You know, there's an argument that it cuts more efficiently because there's more shear action. Just the personal preference I've developed is away from very strong curves. I'd much rather have something about like this is looking now. Yeah, I'm liking that. I like it. Okay, let's move on to these cheeks. Okay, let's reboot here. I stupidly filed this part, you know, flatter before we tested the axe, but that's all right. We have that original video I did of testing the axe and, you know, how it cut. I was going to do some depth tests between the stock grind and the grind I'm going to put on it, but we can't do that now. Okay, so I started to grind on here just a little bit. As you can see, I put a bevel on the edge here. But it was fairly wide and it was pretty, well, if you look at it this way, steep. It wasn't very acute, relatively blunt. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this cheek down and make it thinner. And a simple way to do that is to use the eye here as a reference. And say if you lay your file flat here, I kind of like lifted. You don't want to file the eye itself. I mean, I don't care if it gets a little scratched myself. But if you lift this very slightly off the eye and file this, you'll start to get a bite and you'll start to form like a flat spot here. And then that'll drop more and more. It'll creep further back here and closer to the edge. And if we take that closer down to the edge here, this axe is going to cut much better. Now, obviously, you can vary that a little bit. Like if you want a really specific angle, then you can, you know, tip this up a little more or less. Also, this is a thick-eyed axe. So if I did this on an American axe, it's necessarily going to be a little bit more acute this way. So it might end up at 15 degrees instead of 17 or something like that. Don't take those numbers seriously. That's just me trying to give you some kind of reference. It's good to have the right file. If you use like the most common file, mill bastard file that's small, like a short one, then it's going to cut pretty slow and this is going to take a really long time. Anyway, it's a double cut file, so it cuts really aggressively. It's a large file. The way files work is that if you have a double cut mill bastard that's 14 inches long or a double cut bastard that's 8 inches long, the teeth are totally different. You know, it's like the teeth and the spacing on the teeth get bigger as the file gets bigger. It's weird. Like it would make more sense to do it by teeth per inch, but if you take a mill bastard file and you expand it into a 14-inch file, the teeth become further apart and it's a more aggressive coarse cut. So it's kind of weird, but that's how it works. So a large double cut file like this is usually going to be, you know, pretty aggressive once it gets cutting. This one's pretty old and well used. but already it's starting to bite in pretty good. On this one, since I ground this flat to re-profile this, I'm going to have to do a lot of extra grinding. Like, I'm going to have to come in like this here on this bevel. Let me get a bite going here. And I have to totally regrind this whole area, and that's going to make me have to take even a lot more off of this. So this is going to be a bit of a job now that I flatten that off to grind. Otherwise it wouldn't have taken too long. So as far as safety goes, it's really not hard to slip like this and hit your fingers on that. Don't underestimate how bad an injury you can get doing that, or how easy it is to actually do that. There are people who will tell you to never file an axe that direction and always file it this direction because it's safer. I find that doesn't really work for me, you know, in terms of like ergonomics or whatever. Just be really careful whatever you choose to do. You can put a guard on here, like a piece of plywood or a metal jar lid or something like that, to act as like a guard in case you slip, and it'll protect your hand to at least some extent. I don't think that's a bad idea at all. So I'm thinking basically, again, in terms of two different bevels. I need to get into a groove here. I'm not filing very well. You know, one that's going to be like this up here and how thin this is, and then the second one's going to be the edge bevel. Okay, so I need to do that on the other side until I get kind of an edge here. I think I'm pretty close. Take a couple more strokes. So here's a trick. If you have a pretty dull file, like this is just all been used. I mean, this is what happens when you use files. Very rarely is the tip used as much as the main body of the file. Often the base is also sharper and less used. So you can see maybe that I can get a really good cut. This is like what the file used to cut like, versus up here it just doesn't cut quite as deep. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the main body bevel here. Again, I'm just lifting slightly off the eye. I'm kind of scratching the eye up a little bit once in a while. As I start to get the cut established, I'll take longer and longer strokes. I certainly wouldn't say this axe feels particularly hard, which is fine. It's kind of average. Axes aren't very hard, and they shouldn't be, because, you know, they're made, most axes, you know, hewing axes and hewing hatchets are often quite hard, but they're more like a woodworking tool, not a woods tool. Woods tools, you know, they come under some tremendous stresses sometimes. I hit a rock with the toe of my axe the other day, busted it in half, chipped out a big piece of the rock. Fortunately, it was a soft rock. These things happen. Now, look how much dust I'm getting in these big shavings like that. That's because of the file I'm using. If you're to collect some files for general use, or especially if you work with axes a lot, number one I'd say is a farmer's file like this. I left this out accidentally for a couple days. It's totally not ruined or anything. It's just not ideal for sure. But this has a double cut side and a single cut side. The double cut side isn't as aggressive and large toothed as this, but it's very useful, and the fine side's really useful for refining and sharpening. And then probably the second file I would recommend, major file, is if you do a lot of axes, is something like this. This is, I think, a 14-inch, you know, double cut, probably a mill bastard. I'm not sure though. It doesn't say. I'd have to like measure the teeth. But this thing really moves metal fast. Now I kind of prefer to file my axes instead of grind them. I mean, I've done both, and I have a belt grinder. I could set it up and use that. But I find personally that I become impatient when I'm using a machine that works really fast. Suddenly my work becomes about how fast I can get it done, or how fast I expect to be able to get it done with this machine, versus just doing it right and, you know, taking this time, like it's one slow cut at a time, and it really lets you assess everything as you're going. Okay, now all this metal I'm taking off is going to make a big difference in how this axe cuts. Now we have something closer to like a 1/16 along this edge right here, and that's closer to what I want. Again, this isn't even sharp on the edge yet because I filed this flat. I think I'm going to real quick try to establish a little bit more of a flat grind on this just to get a reference point, and then I'm going to flip it over, you know, do the bevel here again on the other side until those two meet maybe. Another thing we can do, it's hard to stay, you know, real steady with that. I thought I had a big single cut file out here, but I don't seem to. So another thing we can do is just hold this here. Again, I'm going to hold it very slightly off the eye. And I'm going to start filing like this. And that's going to give us an idea of what we're really doing, because when I was filing that, I'm kind of like rocking it a little bit. I'm not obtaining a very flat grind. But as this starts to bite in, this is a very fine tooth file, which isn't really what I want right now. This is going to give us a real idea of what this edge is doing, because it's going to form a perfectly flat plane. Don't tell me about dragging files and how I shouldn't and I should never, blah, blah, blah. So now you see what's really happening. If I lay this pretty flat, I'm just slightly above the eye up here. A nice flat grind. And now we can see that I'm really still 1/8 of an inch from here. And I'm closer to like a 1/16 up here, not so much there. So I still have a lot of metal to remove right in this area. I've had so many people tell me that I should never backdrag the file, you know, at all. And I just have not had a single person give me any compelling evidence that I shouldn't lightly backdrag my file like I'm doing now. It just seems to be kind of hearsay, you know, like, or common knowledge, kind of everybody knows. You hear this thing repeated enough times and it just becomes this, like, truth. If you've got something compelling to say about it, it could be, you know, real personal experience or something else. But if it's just like, you know, this reference said so, and this is like a definitive reference or something, I don't know really much respect for that. I take it into account, but I've been backdragging my files for a long time and I ain't planning to stop. But I don't do it with a lot of pressure. So we're gonna have to flip this back and forth a few times, finesse it a little bit, and after I get this side about the same, I'll take the axe out and look down it this way and this way. See if I need to make any major adjustments to the edge to steer it back in line like that. I think I'll just go ahead and start here. So this is about the same amount of filing I did on the other side, I think. I don't want to come quite to an edge until I take this out and look at it from these two directions to see how straight the bit is and if I need to make any kind of adjustments that way. So let's just try to do the same basic work that I did on the other side, on this side as well. See if I can establish a nice flat cut and try to maintain it a little bit. Okay, I've done about the same amount of work to both sides. I probably should have done this before I even started, but I just want to take a look at the axe this way, so I'm gonna look, you know, I'm looking down the edge like this is my view right now. And this has to do with really the evenness of the grind, the alignment with the handle. Like I can see that I took off more on this side, making that bevel than I did on this side. Kind of look at it straight on a little bit. It looks pretty good overall. I just want to take a little bit extra off of this side here. The original edge is still maintained at the very corners, so I don't even take anything off there yet. Yeah, that looks better. At some point I want to get down to an actual edge on this so I can judge how far this flat is going down to the edge, because if I go say a 1/16 of an inch, but this edge isn't finished yet, by the time I finish the edge it's going to be back at an 1/8 or something like that. So I feel like I'm close. See how wide that's getting? It was like less than a 1/16 of an inch, I think. It's good to try to establish like a nice flat cut, because the file will cut better if it's biting into a kind of a flat surface up to a point. So anytime I tip just slightly up, it'll tend to skid, or if I tip slightly this way, it'll skid. You also notice that I'm cutting slightly across like this. That's a little bit safer because my hand here is traveling over away from the edge versus going straight into it like this. All right, before I flip this axe over, you can see I want to have like a little bit of an edge here, but I'm going to be filing that some more. So I'm going to put this, you know, higher above here because I'm forming a more obtuse angle, less acute angle. And I'm just going to draw file this. Draw filing means that you're basically pushing the file this way versus this way. And you can use a file at a lot of different variable angles to get it to do what you want. But yeah, draw filing is essentially like pushing this way. So a great technique for axes especially is to keep this relatively stationary, and you can either use it to grind a flat grind back here in the main body of the axe, so I'm barely just holding it a little bit over the top of the eye. And again, this is a good way to judge where you're at in terms of this grind that it'll really tell you exactly where you're at. It looks like I'm a little less close over here, like I could stand to take a little bit off. Like here, or I could even just do it like this. Okay, close enough, but I want to tip this up now and establish my secondary bevel. On this side, just a little bit. That's a little under a 1/16, but the other side needs to be filed more because this still isn't even an edge. It's still flat from me, you know, reprofiling it this way. But that's kind of close to what this side will probably look like. Okay, I almost have an edge there. So I'm going to come back with this side here. And just see if I establish a flat bevel, secondary bevel here at an angle that's reasonable for chopping, just all the way across here. Then I'm going to start checking. Okay, we got an edge, 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 flat, but almost an edge. So this area right here needs a little more. Okay, edge, edge, almost an edge here. Yeah, and I think the bevel I left on the other side is about equal to this. Hopefully you guys can see that. secondary bevel there. It just depends on whether the light's right or not. And now I want to go back to flat filing this. Again though, let's take this and see how I'm doing, because this looks pretty rounded. It's going to take me a minute to start establishing a good cut, and then the file will start to bite more. Another trick you can use is to tip the file up this way. Not that much, I'm exaggerating, but very, very slightly, and that'll make these teeth right here bite, and the file will bite. That's a good trick to use with dull files, and also to just establish a bite. It will make kind of deeper scratches. And then once it really gets to biting, see how it's like biting now and shaving it well, then you can flatten the file out. Good trick for used files that are kind of dull. There we go. Now if you want, you can leave these corners a little thicker. A way to judge that is how wide this bevel is. Leave it, maybe the bevel a little wider here and a little narrower down here. That'll protect your corners if the axe is seeing a lot of abuse. Or the thing everyone talks about, I don't have a big problem with it here, but is chopping in really hard knots. So conifers like hemlock is the one everyone talks about. Back east, I don't have hemlock here, so no direct experience. I mean, I have chipped an axe on like a fir knot, like a really hard. Certain knots get super hard, but it's not a common problem here. Or maybe you're chopping in super hard dry wood a lot. I typically will take it down pretty much the same as the rest of the edge. Okay, I'm going to set you guys up a little bit closer so you can definitely see these bevels, because I'm not sure if you can see. I'm pretty sure you guys can see now this secondary flat bevel right there, and you can get maybe a better idea what I'm doing. So I'm still working down this thickness here in the cheek till I get a little bit closer. I basically have an edge established all the way along here. I'm probably going to go for about a 1/16 of an inch. I think for a general purpose axe, I don't necessarily always want it quite that close to the edge, like a real 1/16 of an inch. But if I start at a 1/16, it's quickly going to get sharpened back. 3/32 and then an 1/8 and whatever. So there are people that will argue that you should, not have any flat surfaces on your axe like this right here. It hasn't been a problem for me. I mean, I think the theory is that it will stick more because there's more surface contact. I mean, I could also make an argument if we don't test either proposition, I could also make a logical argument that having a wider contactive surface on a thin axe versus like a small area of contact would spread the pressure out and spread the friction out versus like pinching one spot into the wood. I don't know which is true. I just, I'll worry about it when it seems to be causing me some kind of problem. I'm not saying they're wrong. I don't believe anything either way. I just don't care at this point about having flat surfaces. Seems to work good for me. So this is relatively flat. Now it's not perfectly flat because these edges dip off a little and I'm kind of going over this way and up and over, so it's a little bit curved maybe this way, but it's pretty flat, close to 1/16. I'm just going to take a little more off this end here. It looks like I've removed less. I don't know what it sounds like to you, but I'm not applying very much pressure on the back when I drag this back, so it's important to me to get this job done quick. And I'm not going to like lift my file up. It just takes longer, It's not the same as just doing this. Just lifting the pressure on the backstroke. You do whatever you want. I don't really care what you do. Just don't preach at me. Okay, on this one I have about 1/8 of an inch here, maybe a little less. A little tiny bit less here and quite a bit less here. And we have an edge on the whole thing. This pivot point draw filing until we're about a 1/16 across this whole thing. And then I'll check my work, which I should have been doing this whole time. Now I'm barely holding the tip of the file over here, barely holding it off the top of the eye there. getting closer. I mean, this is perfectly functional the way it is. Again, I just want to take it pretty close to the edge. You know, some people will take it very, very close. Personally, you know, I'm not that careful with my axes. Things happen, you know, the edge gets chipped, it gets hit in the dirt, and for a tool that I'm working in the woods with, next to the ground all the time, like bucking on the ground on small wood, I don't want it to be too fragile because I'm just not that careful. And, you know, the thinner you make this part of the axe, the more vulnerable it is. Again, there's an interplay between this thickness, this angle, which they're mostly this thickness and this angle are kind of the same, not quite, but kind of this width and this angle, and all those things interplay in terms of like, does the axe cut, how well does it cut, and how fragile or robust is it. And a lot of people will grind their axes more for safety than for performance. Some people will grind them for performance and just screw safety. I'm kind of like probably a little in between, because I know how often I stick the toe of my axe in the dirt and hit rocks and stuff like that, and it's a lot. And I ain't planning on babying my axe or taking the time all the time to prevent those accidents, because they cost you. You know, that costs you like constant attention and time and care and moving things around so that you're in like safer positions and all that. I'd just rather bung my axe up once in a while, do quick repair, and get back to work. Now, if you've never chopped with an axe like this, you're going to be in for a revelation. Again, the real important thing, I think, is that it gives you a reference for an axe that cuts. Whatever you want to decide to do with your axes in the future and all that, experiment, break rules, modify this idea and do something else, whatever you want, but you'll have a reference for an axe that cuts, and then next time you get an axe that doesn't cut, you'll be like, oh, okay, screw that. Okay, so now we're just going to wet this up with a whetstone real quick, and we're ready to chop. All right, I have my usual Japanese waterstone axe puck. I make these out of king waterstones, dual-sided waterstones. Watch my video on that because it's awesome. This is basically like $5 or less for this axe puck. This is actually my original one. Look how thin the coarse side is now. It's about $280 or $250 and $1,000. Now I'm going to start with the coarse side because I just want to take out some of these file marks. I don't really care that much, and there aren't very many because the technique I was using with the draw filing, with the really fine file, like the fine side of that farmer's file, I recommend that file, by the way. It's a Baco. I'll put a link, Amazon affiliate link in the description, also to this stone. But the teeth are finer than a bastard file, and it actually leaves a pretty smooth finish. I don't know if you can see that. But still, I'm going to start with the coarse side real quick to get out any big scratches. I may even come back up in here to get rid of some of these old scratches just for the fun of it. Typically, if I'm grinding the main bevel like this, I'll just use kind of a back and forth straight motion because it's pretty flat anyway. This stone isn't perfectly flat. I don't really keep it maintained very flat, but I'm going to come back in here and try to just take out some of the scratches, or like minimize them a little bit. And I'm not trying to get them all the way out. That'll take a while. Okay, so that's the main bevel. Let's go do the other side. Okay, now onto the 1000 side. Again, I'm going to kind of go up here and just polish this a little bit, but mostly I'm doing this flat bevel right here. I haven't even got to the edge yet. Now, if anyone out there has gotten this waterstone and is not happy with it, or if you got one and you're happy with it, I'd love to hear comments on that. So far, I've received nothing but positive comments. You know, I'm still a big fan. I've pretty much worn this one out, and I'm not at all unhappy about the decision. I think the only real serious problem with them is that they wear out quickly. And if you do really a lot of chopping, I mean, you'll wear through them, but you can make at least 3 this size and then one that's a little bit smaller dimension out of one stone. And they're as cheap as $15 sometimes. So you're talking about $5 or less per axe puck, some of the time at least. I just think it's the best idea ever. And with the cost of like expensive fancy axe pucks, yeah, it's an incredible bargain. Like it's the best stone at the best price kind of thing. And as I point out in the video, you can cut this off the end and still have a 6-inch water stone for sharpening your knives and other tools. It's all good news, man. Draw filing the way I was with that fine file, this is totally fine to just finish with the 1000 grit. I don't even need to use the coarse side of this. So I'm putting on the secondary bevel. All right, one last step here is I'm going to strop with my little pocket strop. These are great. Make one. Use anything like a tongue from an old boot or a piece of belt or something. You see all this dark stuff there? That is metal from stropping tools. There's a polishing compound on here, and you can use it on without a polishing compound of any kind, like no abrasive, but if you put something on there, it really turns it from just a tool to kind of bend the edge back and forth until the burr breaks off and you kind of refine it to an actual polishing tool. So I'm just going to strop this. Sometimes I'll strop them just at a slightly higher angle to put on like the really it's a micro bevel is what it is. A real micro bevel, like one you can't see. It's also fine to just strop it at the same angle. If you tip it up a little bit, it's going to make that edge just like a little more durable. Practically speaking, I don't know if it even matters. Yeah, so as far as tools to set up your axe, and I'm just talking about the bit, like, you know, grinding, sharpening, and maintaining. Baco Farmer's file has two sides, coarse, fine. Yes, I would rather use a 14-inch double cut file that's a little bit more aggressive, but you can totally do it with just this file. And this is a very, very versatile file with the two different sides here, and it's a good size. This is a 10-inch. You could also get the 8, but I would get the 10 if you can, unless you need to carry it. The King Waterstone, double-sided, 250, 1000. Cut off of a 8-inch stone and just a little pocket strop that you can make yourself. Put some polishing compound on that just to prove a point, because you don't need your axes to be shaving sharp. Usually by the time I'm done with my axes, even when I do a quickie job, they're shaving sharp, unless I'm doing like a really quick like field strop or something like that. But it is a good, you know, proof that you're there, and you know I'm definitely there. Well, it's getting kind of late here, but let's just do a little bit of chopping since this thing's all fresh and ready to go. As way of example of real life work versus theoretical, like you're going to be super careful with your axe all the time and never ever this and never ever that. This log's been sitting on the ground for a while. It's like a big limb from a fir tree that had to get trimmed. And, you know, it kind of got buried in the dirt. There could be rocks stuck in there. There could be like mud with rocks embedded in it. There's rocks in this soil, so if I miss by just like that little, you know, centimeter, then I hit the dirt. You know, things happen. This is real life out here in the dirty bush. So, you know, I could say, well, you know, I'm going to chop the bark off of the log first. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to chop it. I'm not even going to really look. Like if I see a big glob of mud, I might, you know, turn the log, kick it, like cut it somewhere else or something like that. But otherwise, you know, this is real life, and that's just how it goes. Accidents happen. The other factor is that if I'm, you know, so careful all the time not to ever, never, ever, whatever, you know, damage my axe edge, this takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of attention. It takes time. You know, what am I gonna be like moving? And I'm like looking at everything all the time. And it's not like I don't do any of that. I do that stuff to some extent. I'm not just like swinging wildly and randomly sticking the axe in the dirt. But, you know, there's like 100%, and then there's like most of the time I'm not gonna, you know, make any serious accidents like that happen. So yeah, that's my take on that. So let's just see how this thing sinks into wood. It's gonna take me a little time to get used to this. I'm not used to using a handle this short. I'm thinking this is probably about 25.5 inches now, but this should cut real nice now. Let's check it out. I'm just gonna go kind of light here until I start to get a feel for this axe. I don't want to, you know, miss and hit my leg here. Not too bad for not fully going for it. I hardly chopped at all this year, so I'm pretty rusty. Well, I don't know how many hits I was, but I'm halfway through and my accuracy was terrible, so not so bad. I think I'll just run along here and make a series of cuts and then do the other side. Just want to start getting a feel for this axe. I think I'll go over a few like safety and talking points on chopping like this too. This is something that a lot of people don't do a lot of, is this kind of like bucking at ground level. It can be very, very dangerous. You want to keep your feet, you know, back here below this level when you can, unless you're, you know, standing on a log. I'll often hold the log, the smaller it is, the more this is true, with my toes. And that may seem dangerous, but try not doing that and see how that goes for you. And a lot of you already have, and every time you hit it, the whole piece moves and then you're chasing it around. You know, it's more unpredictable. You're wasting energy because every time you hit it, like, it moves the whole log. Like, that's energy you could have been using to drive the axe deeper into the wood. My toes are actually bent up at the back, you know, as long as your shoes are flexible. Kind of bent up at the back, but I try to keep my toe level below the top of the log. So that's one thing that I do pretty consistently. On a log about this size and smaller, and even sometimes larger, I will have my toes at the back of the log to hold the thing still so I can like actually work. Now the idea safety wise is that if you have any deflection, it's going to go like, it's going to bounce up this way and go towards, you know, somewhere on this side of that line and kind of deflect backwards this way. So far in my experience, that is always true. I can remember one time when I was standing on top of a log where the axe deflected slightly and bumped into my foot. It was like really barely anything. Other than that, my experience is that that's true. However, I'll show you when I get to the top of the log what I do to increase my safety doing that. When I'm cutting at the top of the log. There's a knot right there. It's gonna wanna get a little sticky. Okay, I think I just, yeah, I nicked the dirt a little bit there. When I'm working near the top of the log here, I will point the axe bit down more, you see, like that, versus like this. Because if I'm going like this and I just like misjudge a little bit, or if I cut through more than I think, you know, I'm like kind of cutting towards myself. I think that really increases your safety if you're paying attention to that direction of cut, right? So I'm just really paying attention to which direction this bit is headed, and instead of coming this way towards me, I'm just gonna point it downward a little bit. So that looks about like that. Okay, again, see, I kind of pointed down this way versus pointing back at me this way. I think I'm just going to hack this end off. Starting to get a little more comfortable, but I feel pretty awkward chopping with a new axe and being out of practice and everything. That was lame. Yeah, okay, we'll just roll that over. Yeah, see, there's all kinds of mud and dirt here. No big deal. Get a few nicks or whatever, just grind them out and get back to work. You do have to swing these axes with a little bit of authority to get them to cut deep. So be careful with that, because it can lead to clumsy chopping, lack of control. Okay, so I got a golfer mound in front of me. It's full of rocks. Yeah, I'm gonna stop and move that. You know, it's not like I don't pay any attention. I'm just not into this idea that if you ever hit any dirt or rocks with your axe, you're some kind of like hyper noob. Okay, pointing down again so that I don't come through that thin cut and hit myself. Got a knot right here, so instead of trying to chop through that knot, I'm just going to come right up to it flat and make a flat cut here. That's a pain in the butt. It sticks more, it doesn't cut very deep. Look at all that dirt on there. Can you see that? It's just caked with mud. Let's see if we could split some of this. Looks like there's a bunch of knots in there. You hear that sound, that pop, that deep, thick pop sound? That's the sound of that wood coming in half. I missed the mark there. Close enough though. It's here. This one's pretty much in half. Just finish that off. We could have just pulled that in half. Doesn't seem like I'm having too much trouble splitting this wood with this thin ground axe, does it? knot right here holding that together. Like you just come in at it like right there. All right, that's enough for tonight. I would say that this axe is like pretty much how I want it. I mean, there are other things we're going to do. I'm going to saturate the handle with linseed oil, not until I get the handle shaved down exactly where I want it, which I'm not done with yet. I'll just do that kind of randomly as it starts to, you know, as it bugs me sometime. And otherwise, you know, the head is set up the way that I want it. I'm not probably going to change much of anything about that. I would say right now this axe is a better axe than a stock Gransfors Bruks Forest Axe, which costs about twice as much, I think, or maybe more. Would I rather have a Gransfors? Maybe. I don't like this weird deep stamp right here. I owned the equivalent of this in Gransfors Bruks. I also have access to one right now that my friend has just next property over. If someone was giving me one, yeah, I would probably take the Gransfors over this. Is this going to be way more work to set up? Yeah, probably. Like the Gransfors handle fit is better. And the handle's not quite as thick, but it's still pretty absurdly thick, and you're going to have to, well, I mean, if you're me, you're going to have to shave it down a lot. So that's the same. You're still going to have to file it. Probably this silhouette shape right here is going to be better, but you're still going to have to file the cheeks down to get it to cut really well. You know, it's not like you're not going to do any work is what I'm saying, and you're going to pay a lot more for it. So we'll probably work on this sheath a little bit, like modify it or just build a different one, because it tends to kind of fall off and it's just not very good. And then we'll test this axe and use it, maybe cut down and process some more trees into firewood, maybe do a little hewing and carving or something, just to prove the point that this is what I say it is, which is a, you know, compromise axe that can do a lot of work. Like it can do a lot of different work and it can do it fairly competently. Yes, it's limited in almost everything you're going to apply it to. It has some like limitation, except if you look at the big picture and you're like, I need an axe that does a little bit of everything, that is capable of doing almost anything, but that is transportable and light and, you know, not too hard to use with one hand. And that's what these axes really are. So even after doing that work, I know it wasn't that much, but that log was pretty gritty. I mean, there's like mud caked on and I was chopping right into the mud. This part of the axe will still shave my arm, albeit a little bit hesitantly. Don't obsess about your axe edge and about babying your axe. It's a tool, you know, not a piano or whatever. It's not a violin. If your axe is so precious and so expensive and whatever that you need to be that careful with it, why would you even take it into the field? Like, just put it in your axe humidor and grab a real tool and go do some work. Stop worrying and start working. Don't obsess over these things that don't really matter. Is it possible that you will severely damage your axe? Or have to spend like a half an hour fixing it at some point? Yeah, totally. But, you know, you just need to, anyone that does a lot of work in the field, like real work in the real field with dirt and mud and all this stuff and who knows what, is going to come to kind of a similar conclusion that you can only be so careful all the time without costing yourself some productivity and just excessive worry and stress of like constantly being like assessing everything overly paranoid. So yeah, I'll see you next time, and we'll put this thing to a little bit more work and just do some finishing touches on it. Over and out. Good enough for now. Real quick, just check out the growth rings on this limb. This is fairly near the base, so this isn't too much less than the age of it, but if I just count real quick from right here, 1, 2, 3, 1, 22, so that's about an inch, 22, maybe 25 years an inch on that part. This part looks like it grew quite a bit faster. This limb could be as old as me. Wasn't too easy to chop. I mean, it's not horrible or anything, but I wouldn't be surprised if our oaks chop is easier or easier than that stuff. Not that it's as hard necessarily, it's just, it's a little tough.